Good evening, class. My name is Ashlyn Watson, and my presentation will be on Sylvia Plath and her contribution to confessional poetry with the poem called Daddy. We will discuss her, but we will also do a brief biography on Anne Sexton. Miss Sexton was a huge inspiration to Sylvia Plath in this poem and in a lot of her works. Sylvia Plath was born in Boston in 1932. She attended Smith College and Newnham College. Plath's father died when she was only 8 years old. Since then, she had always held an unforgivable grudge for him because he died before she could make him proud. She was a gifted writer and ever since the age of 15 and won many awards for her poems and writings. When Plath was an undergraduate, it was then she began to suffer from severe depression. It was later she took a large amount of pills and overdosed. She was remanded to a psychiatric hospital and was treated with shock therapy. After her release, Plath returned to work and released one of the greatest poems she had ever written, called Daddy. This poem entails the feelings she carried for her father and how she felt about him before and after death. Prior to her death, Plath released a short story known as The Bell Jar. After Plath committed suicide, it would come to be known as one of the greatest poems ever written by her that shows confessional poetry and a deep sense of foreshadowing. Plath won a Pulitzer Prize for her work, but by the time she could have received it, it was too late. Anne Sexton, she was born as Anne Gray Harvey. She pursued a long career in literature and poetry. She was married to Alfred Muller Sexton at the age of 19. Anne later was diagnosed with postpartum depression during her pregnancy and suffered from her first mental breakdown. The second time she had a child, she tried committing suicide and was remanded to a psychiatric hospital. After her mental breakdown, Sexton's doctor recommended that she continue to pursue her career in writing poetry. In Sexton's complete poems, she had finally completed a list of poems that reflected her life and the things she wanted to express. The workshop she had became a second home for her because writing helped her express her depression. Her great writing won the Pulitzer Prize for her poetry in 1967 for one of her greatest poems called Live or Die. Sadly, Sexton's success didn't bring her happiness. She later gave up on the battle against mental illness and depression and committed suicide. A quick summary on the poem Daddy. The poem Daddy was written by Sylvia Plath in 1965. It was initially created in 1962, but was only released to the public because of Plath's will after death. This poem is dedicated to Anne Sexton because she truly admired and looked up to her. Plath wanted the poem to be considered a dedication to Sexton's death because she was also fell victim to severe depression and eventually committed suicide. The poem Daddy is also about Plath's lingering feeling for her father as well as confessionary poetry. She confesses to loving her father but hating and loathing him at the same time. Plath discusses her childhood from the war times to adulthood and about how the things she could have been different if her father was alive. In the end, Plath could no longer bear the pain of losing her father and she committed suicide. She was revived for a short amount of time just to say that she would be with her father again. In the first stanza, starts off by giving the reader a brief feeling of what the author felt like in her childhood. The emotions of saying for 30 years she was poor and white, barely able to breathe, talking about how she lived in fear and in pain and scared to live. The second stanza describes how in her mind she had to let him go. He was so evil that she couldn't love him, but he died before she could come to terms with how to process this. In stanza 3, the author describes what she sees. She sees a head in the Atlantic. The only head that comes to my mind is the Statue of Liberty in all her glory. It pours beaming green over blue waters. This shows and clarifies that the author is talking about the Statue of Liberty. The statement, "I used to pray to recover you," could be aimed at either her father or the statue, and by her talking about the Statue of Liberty could mean talking about how she thrives for the freedom that is represented by the Statue of Liberty. In stanza 4, she relates to the Holocaust. The key words are mentioned: the German tongue, the Polish town, wars, and my Polak friend, assuming the story is around war times and the Germans invaded the author's town during a war. Stanza 5, our author describes her feelings at the time of war. She is surrounded by a friend, but she never had the courage to really talk about her own father. She felt as if her tongue was stuck in her jaw, meaning that she wanted to speak, but she just couldn't bear to do it. In stanza 6, our author still discusses how she is unable to talk about her father. She begins to remember how he was through the similarities of the other Germans that she comes in contact with. She says every one of them speak the German language, which the author thinks is obscene because it reminds her of how hateful her father was and how it was just a negative thing. In stanza 7, the author is describing an engine, likely a bus or even a train, that could carry her off. She mentions Auschwitz, and the author thinks that she may be a Jew as well. In stanza 7, the narrator is speaking of her ancestors and her weird luck, which can be, the weird luck could be a stigma based on Jewish people. And the narrator may be realizing that she is actually Jewish herself. So now we're starting to see the irony of this, because relating that her father might actually be a German Nazi and she might herself actually be Jewish. In stanza 9, the narrator is confirming her father is a Nazi with his neat mustache and his Luftwaffe, referring to the German army, and the iron eye, bright blue. These are all things that could be associated with the German army. In stanza 10, the author mentions the swastika, which is the German Nazi symbol. The symbol was so black that the sky could not be seen through it, and the boot of the brute is the symbolistic actions of the Nazi German army being so forceful and evil. When invading a village, town, and a country, the Nazis used to put their boots on people's heads or in their faces as if they were supposed to recognize Nazi Germany as a power stronger than God. And then she says, brute heart of a brute like you, talking about how evil, even though her father was in that he was so evil himself. In stanza 11, the author holds a picture of her father being next to a blackboard, narrating how she has learned about the evil life her father lived. The author also mentions having a cleft on his chin instead of his foot. A cleft chin is a chin with a dimple that makes it split in half. She's relating his chin to the boot of a Nazi soldier because their boots have spaces in between the front and the back of them. In stanza 10, our author mentions her hair being bitten in two by a black man from stanza 9-10. Don't believe bear as she describes, but she probably just meant that she split her hair in two like pigtails. She also mentions her father being buried when she was at the age of 10. Sylvia throws us a hint of the confessional poetry by saying, at 20, I tried to die and get back to you. This was her confession that she tried to commit suicide in her 20s. The analysis for stanza 11 is pretty confusing, but if you go back and read it, you can kind of put it together. So before, she mentioned how she commits suicide and they put her back together. But then they say the author talks about being pulled out of a sack and being stuck back together. Then she says, I made a model of you. So meaning once she realized she had to continue living life and living with this depression and the memory of her father, she made a model of him, meaning that she probably met someone like her father. And in stanza 12, she says, I do, referring to marrying the man that is like her father, which some say is a common thing. In stanza 15, our author seems to be continuing on not being completely in spirit. For example, the first point that really stands out, which is a little odd, is vampire. And for this poem to be about confessions and how she feels, vampire may be a little strange, but maybe vampire meaning that she is alive but not completely alive, and then referring to how she says the vampire who said he was you, talking about her husband and the similarities of her husband and how she remembers her father, and maybe also them who she might believe is vampire in their mind, because especially her father being dead, but she still remembers him and can't shake the feeling and the memories of him. So he's there, but he's not really there. And then she goes on to say, the vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, and then continues going on for 7 years. So after this point, she's been with this man for a while and is relating the evil between her husband and her dad. And she's maybe using drinking her blood as a word for her soul, because he also drains her as her father did, and the memory that she had of her father. And that still, just her father's death had that big of an impact on her since her childhood. In the last stanza of this poem, the author is, she called her father a bastard. And in the beginning, we've seen how her love kind of progressed into hate. We got a second idea of how she felt about him. And she talks about how the villagers never liked her father and how they stamped on him. In the first line in the stanza, the daughter mentions a stake in her father's black heart. This is going back to the reference of the vampires and the mythology behind that of to kill a vampire, you must stab it in the heart with a stake. And then she goes on to say she is through. And I think this means that she never really got on with the hatred that she had for her father, and she continued to live her life that way. And then confessional poetry was a movement started in the 1950s. Poets write about their own personal experience in an open, direct style. Point Break for Confession, Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton both engaged in confessional poetry. This style of writing allows the authors to tell truths from their lives. In this case, Plath discussed her life and how she viewed it and kind of put it into a story of someone suffering and, that German life. Plath tells the story of how how the child missed her father and couldn't have the courage to deal with it or face it. Some basic info on the background between Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. Plath admired Sexton so much that she wrote the story and dedicated it to Anne Sexton. She wrote how she used to read Anne Sexton's poems all the time because they generally inspired her to pursue her career in writing, but she wanted to pursue it through the confessional poetry method. Plath felt that the reader knew more about her story and what she went through, they would be able to appreciate her work even more. When Plath started releasing her poems about her life, she was voted as one of the best writers of the 19th century, along with Anne Sexton. Plath's most known works are The Bell Jar and The Poetry of the Colossus and Ariel. Plath was pleased when she was awarded with the Pulitzer Prize for The Bell Jar. In 1963, Plath ended up committing suicide, but she will always be remembered for her work. And works cited page. Thank you, and this concludes my presentation.